All right, looks like it is top of the hour, so let's get started. So thank you everyone for joining us. This is your HR Technology Roadmap, Challenges and Opportunities. I'm going to get things started with a few housekeeping items before we dive into the content. So we encourage this to be collaborative, so we'd love it if you would submit questions. You can do so via the question feature on the control panel. If we, for whatever reason, aren't able to get to your question during the presentation, we'll follow up after the webinar, so we'll make sure all the questions get answered. This webinar is part of our series of year-end and beyond webinars. We've got 2 more webinars in this series. Actually, next week, we've got a webinar, What's Transforming in HR in 2022? And then again in mid-February, we're presenting Attracting and Retaining Top Talent in a Tight Labor Market. Both really fantastic topics. We'd encourage you to join us for those. More information will be provided in the follow-up email that's going to be sent after today's session. Some of you may have heard me mention earlier, you can download the slides from the handout section in the control panel. So you can either, follow along with us or save that for future reference. So definitely encourage you to grab the slides. And then lastly, we are offering professional credit for today's presentation, both CPE and HRCI credit. In order to qualify for that credit, we're going to be offering some polling questions throughout the webinar. You are going to need to respond to those. And then at the conclusion of the webinar, we're going to have a survey, and you're also going to need to respond to that survey. And then the certificates for your credit will be emailed to you 2 to 3 weeks after the program. Okay, and with that, let's get started. So Cindy, if you want to go to the next slide, I think we'll do some intros. Actually, you want to go back, and Cindy, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you, Steve. My name is Cindy Walter. I'm a managing director at Sikich in the Human Capital Management and Payroll Consulting team. I've been in human resources, I'm just going to say for 30 plus years, managing all aspects of HR, operations, technologies, shared service centers. Thank you, Steve.
You bet. And I am Steve Dawson, also Managing Director in Sikich's Human Capital Management and Payroll Consulting practice. I have been in the HR technology space for a little over 25 years. A lot of that time, on the practitioner side, but also a number of years in consulting. And I'm just really thrilled to be here today. I think we've got some really good content for you. So Cindy, if you want to jump to the agenda. So let's look at what we're going to talk about today. So we basically organized today's session into 2 sections. So I'm going to kick things off. We're going to talk about the HR technology roadmap. What is it? Why bother? And kind of what's the approach to building that out? And then I'm going to hand it off to my co-presenter, Cindy, and she's going to talk to you about how you get this funded and what are some different strategies and approaches, for how you get the financial support you need to execute on the roadmap. Okay, Cindy, next slide. All right, so let's start with some basics and let's look at, what is an HR technology roadmap so we all get on the same page. All right, so what is a roadmap? So at its simplest level, a roadmap is simply a detailed plan that outlines a specific course of actions that take you from kind of where you are to where you want to go, which sounds simple enough. But what we often find is a lot of organizations need assistance with this, largely because both their current state and their future state are fuzzy at best. And they need some help in order to be able to move forward. Cindy, next slide. So what are some of the benefits of the HR technology roadmap, right? Why do this? I think for me, this really boils down to 2 things. which is, clarity and focus, right? By having a roadmap, you make sure that you're using your resources, both, human resources as well as your financial capital, to focus on those activities that are going to be highest value add for your organization. And without a roadmap, right, you don't necessarily know whether or not you're focused on the right things. And so that's primarily the benefit of an HR technology roadmap. Okay, so that all sounds well and good in theory. You may be asking yourself, okay, but is this going to have an impact in my organization? So the way that we typically think about that is, what I'm sharing on the screen now are, what I would think of as clues that we see in organizations that don't have a roadmap, right? So the idea here is, if any of these things resonate with you, then likely your organization is a really good candidate for an HR technology roadmap, right? So these are things like, you have a number of, HCM systems. Some of them may be duplicative. Oftentimes, you may have different systems for different business units or different systems for different geographies, right? But kind of the point is, your systems are fragmented. They may not be fully integrated. Your data may not be trusted, right? So you may have stakeholders, say finance, for example, that doesn't trust your data. So maybe they keep their own set of data that they trust more because they don't trust HR data. Maybe you're getting a lot of complaints from employees and managers that your systems are just really hard to use. If your HR and payroll organizations are keying lots of transactions, or producing reports requires lots of manual intervention and human effort, these are all signs that you could benefit from an HR technology roadmap. So again, if these things resonate with you, then you're probably a good candidate for this work. Cindy, next slide. All right, so now we'll get into some of the considerations. So before we get into kind of the nitty-gritty around how we approach building the roadmap, I wanted to talk for a minute about sort of the business environment that HR is facing in 2022. So obviously we work with a lot of clients of all different sizes across a wide range of industries. But we've really kind of come up with these 10 key themes that we see that are really common across the HR, function. And, we'll go through these, rather quickly. So we could probably do a whole separate webinar just on these issues. But I'll go through this rather quickly. But the point that I want to make is that all of these business issues all have a really important technology dimension. And I think technology is part of the solution to tackling these issues. So for example, Cindy, if you want to go to the next slide. So for example, what are these issues facing HR? So the first issue is really all about doing more with less, right? And HR, has to be ruthless about getting rid of non-value add administrative work. Okay, managing an organization's talent, right? So it is critical that you be able to attract the best talent, onboard them quickly, and develop them to their full potential, right? When it comes to rewards, you have to make sure that you get the biggest bang for your buck, no pun intended, for your your merit and bonus pools, and that you're spending those monies wisely. Cindy, if you could go to the next slide. Driving organizational performance, right? Getting everyone aligned to a common set of goals and objectives, and making sure that individuals are getting real-time feedback on their performance, right? Promoting diversity and inclusion. This has become really big in the last couple of years. Delivering meaningful insights to your executives. And this isn't just about looking backwards and talking about where you've been. this is also about forecasting, right? And being able to look forward and predict, where the organization is going. Providing operational excellence. So making sure that day to day, those inquiries from employees and managers aren't getting lost in the shuffle. And Cindy, next slide. There's a lot of talk today about employee experience. And, really what that boils down to is employees today, particularly those in the millennial generation, they've become accustomed to the consumer internet. Think Amazon, you think Netflix, and they're expecting to have that same type of digital experience in the workplace, right? And how many organizations are really able to deliver on that? Ensuring data integrity, right? So making sure that your data is trustworthy. And then lastly, maintaining regulatory compliance. So again, HR is responsible for ensuring that the organization complies with a wide range of regulations. And again, the point with all of those is hopefully, multiple of those business issues resonate with you, right? Each organization is going to probably have a different take on those issues, but some of those issues are going to resonate in every organization. And, again, the key point I want to convey is that those are as much technology challenges as they are business issues, right? They're kind of two sides of one coin. And so an HR technology roadmap can help be part of the solution for tackling some of those really thorny business issues, okay? And again, before we dive into the kind of the nuts and bolts on the roadmap itself, I did want to kind of pause and because we are so focused on technology today, and we really wanted to make the point that we're not focused on technology for technology's sake. And while technology is important, right, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And I like to think of technology as part of a three-legged stool, right? And those three legs are, technology, people, and process. And it's really when you get all three of those in alignment that you really get the true synergy with your investments in technology. And so we just don't want to lose sight of the fact that technology just doesn't stand on its own. All right, Cindy. All right, and now we've got our first poll question. All right, question number 1. When was the last time you updated your HR technology roadmap? Was it year-end 2021, mid-year 2021, beginning of 2021, more than 2 years ago, or we do not have an HR technology roadmap? If you could please record your vote, we'd appreciate it. All right. And real-time responses, love it. Okay, 64% do not have a technology roadmap. So that is not unusual. And then 19% more than 2 years ago. Again, not unusual. No one beginning of 2021, 11% mid-year. Hey, that's really good. And 6% year-end. Fantastic. Fantastic. So a wide range of responses there. Again, not unusual. All right, now back to our regular programming. Okay, so now let's really get into how do you build an HR technology roadmap, kind of step by step. So we're gonna walk you through kind of our approach to that. Okay, so we follow a 4-step approach, as you can see here. Step 1, we assess your current state. Step 2, and we look to the future and help define that future state. Step 3, once the future state's clear, then we can build a detailed work plan to take you from step 1 to step 2. And then lastly, with that plan in place, we then look to go get funding for this work, right? At a very high level, that's kind of the approach. All right, so let's dig in. So step one, assessing current state. So this is really a fact-finding step, right? And there are a number of due diligence activities. So you can see, just to get kind of a flavor of the types of things that we're doing here. We're documenting your current systems landscape. We're looking at your vendor relationships, right? And how healthy are those? We're looking at your HR technology team and what kind of skills and capabilities does that team have. We're looking at kind of your current cost for your HR technology. We're talking to a number of key stakeholders about their experience with your technology. And also very important, we look to HR and IT, right, to understand what are the strategies and visions in those areas, right? Where are those functions going, and how well are you aligned to that, right? So this is all work that's going on in that current state assessment. Cindy, if you could go to the next slide. So as I mentioned in the prior slide, a really, really important part of step one are stakeholder interviews. So really kind of two things I want to say about this. One is that we ideally would like to interview a cross-section of stakeholders. And what I mean by that is we want to talk to people at various levels in the organization, from frontline employees and managers up to executive leadership, right? So we want to get the different opinions from all those groups. We also kind of functionally, we want to talk to people in HR, we want to talk to people in IT, we want to talk to finance, and we want to talk to people in the business, because everybody's going to have a different perspective and a valuable perspective. And it gives us a much more holistic picture if we're able to talk to that, kind of range of stakeholders. And the second point I want to make is, when we sit down with these folks, the discussion is pretty straightforward, right? We want to understand what's working well, what do you like, and what's not working so well, right? What's painful, and where do you see opportunities, right? What do you wish the organization had the ability to do that you're unable to do? And those are the things that we're trying to glean. And the more of these interviews we have, the more likely it is that a consistent picture starts to emerge. So Cindy, if you could advance the slide. Okay, so coming out of these interview sessions, we typically see feedback in 4 themes, right? So typically everything can kind of be bucketed into these 4 categories. And it's not uncommon in an organization that we would find all 4, categories. So there are going to be some data issues, typically. There are going to be some technology issues that we encounter. Likely there will be process issues, and there will be operational issues. And each of these are probably independent of one another, but collectively they're all things that need to be addressed in order to get to a better future state. And so one of the pieces I talked about earlier was documenting your current systems landscape. So the point of this slide, so this is a representative sample of what we might find in an organization that doesn't have an HR technology roadmap, and their systems have just kind of evolved organically. And so the point of this slide is not for you to read every little box here and try to figure out what's going on and why are there so many arrows. The point of this slide is to show you that, hey, this organization is really fragmented, and there's a lot of duplication of systems, and there's a lot of data flowing a lot of different directions, which is lots of opportunities for things to get out of sync. And so this is not an uncommon starting point when we come in and do our initial assessments. Okay, and then we're also going to look at your organization, as I mentioned earlier, and try to understand, so what kind of internal capabilities do you have to manage your technology? What are, who are the people, how big's the team, and what kind of capabilities does that team have, right? So we will we will document that. And then next slide, Cindy. And then process, right? So we talked earlier about the importance of process. So these technology roadmaps are not primarily process-centric engagements, right? We're not coming in to document all of your processes and re-engineer them. However, it is very common in the course of our fact-finding that we will uncover maybe a small number of processes that need attention. And if we see that as a theme, where there are processes that multiple people have called attention to that need some re-engineering, then we will obviously document that as part of our findings, because that is clearly something that that needs to be addressed as part of a kind of a holistic roadmap. So what you're seeing on the screen, although fictitious, is representative of how we might document a process to illustrate that it could really use some streamlining. All right, Cindy. Okay, so that's our current state assessment, right? So at this point, we've got a pretty good idea of kind of where you are, but also, what are your unmet needs? What are your pain points? And how well are you or are you not aligned with your business, HR, and IT strategies and visions? Okay, and I think kind of collectively, we would call that, those are your gaps, right, that we need to address, right? So kind of focused on solving for those gaps, we need to have a very strategic conversation about how it is that you want to approach closing those gaps, right? So do you want to buy technology, or do you want to build it in-house? Do you prefer to consolidate with as few vendors as possible and try to really simplify your landscape? Or alternatively, do you prefer to have the best of breed in every kind of niche technology area? And there's no right or wrong answer here. Different organizations will have different perspectives and different priorities, and thus what is the right answer in one organization won't be the right answer in another. So the point here is we've got to figure out what's right for your organization. But once we have that conversation and we kind of understand sort of what path we want to go down, then we can really help you kind of map out your future state. So Cindy, if you want to advance. Okay, so this would be an example, right, as part of that future state, where we might produce a deliverable to kind of paint a picture of, hey, what type of experience do we want our employees to have in the future, right? So that's kind of the point of this slide. Cindy, if you want to jump to the next one. And then similarly, what kind of experience do we want our managers to have, right? And so that's what this slide is doing. And next slide, Cindy. Okay, and then future state landscape, right? Okay, so as a result of that strategic conversation and our understanding of your gaps, what do we think our future kind of technology architecture looks like, right? So we'll help to map that out. And hopefully what you're seeing on this screen looks a whole lot simpler than what you saw in the current state. And to really drive that point home, Cindy, if you could go to the next slide. We often like to show it in this, in this format, because this is kind of your before and after, right? And hopefully this is kind of an aha moment for organizations where they realize that, like, wow, we really did introduce a lot of unnecessary complexity, and there's a real opportunity for us to simplify, right? And that often is something we're able to do in these roadmaps. All right, Cindy, if you could go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk about your organization and look at opportunities where we can make your your HR technology team stronger. So that may be cross training, or investing in some outside training to enhance the team's capabilities. But it may also involve filling some gaps on the team, right? And so it may require filling some vacant positions, right? So again, whatever it is that we think will make that team stronger, that will certainly be part of our future state recommendation. And then lastly, process, right? So if you recall, in our current state, right, we had a process that looked pretty painful, and here it is really streamlined. And so that, again, this would be an example of a deliverable we might produce to, again, illustrate the opportunity you have with the introduction of new technology to fix some processes that are broken. All right, and now we're transitioning from future state. So we've kind of built that future state vision, and we kind of have a clear picture of what that future state looks like. So now we need to really roll up our sleeves and do some detailed planning, right? So this is where we're going to create a bunch of deliverables. We're going to estimate time. We're going to estimate cost. So that's what this step 3 is all about. So this first slide, this is a sample of a deliverable where we're starting to map out your, the different deliverables on your roadmap. And we're starting to think about, what are those discrete pieces of work? How are they related to one another? And, what level of effort is required and what level of impact will it have, right? And by getting clarity on this, it kind of leads into the next slide. So Cindy, if you could jump forward. So then it helps us actually start to schedule these things. So you can see on this slide, now we're starting to take these deliverables and we're putting them in a timeline, and you can see we're delivering these in phases. So this is not a big bang, right? This is a phased implementation. So you can see there's a number of different kind of separate go lives that we've marked off here. You can see a number of these deliverables are being worked on in parallel. And you can see that this timeline extends over 3 years. Now, in this example, and this is not atypical in a larger organization, right? A 3-year journey would not be unusual. If you're making kind of a significant technology investment, it's not uncommon that might last 3 years. Clearly, in a smaller organization, your timeline is going to look different. But this kind of gives you, hopefully, an illustration of what one of these planning deliverables would look like. Okay, and now that we have this understood, now we get into the cost. Okay, and you can see that we get very detailed about, what level of investment is going to be required for this work. And so you can see we have a number of different categories of costs that we get into. One that I want to highlight in particular is staff augmentation. So Cindy, if you just want to jump to the next slide. So this is an area where we find a lot of organizations don't recognize how much help they really need to tackle some of this project work. There's a bias towards using internal resources, which is understandable, but oftentimes it's unrealistic because these resources have a day job. They have limited capacity to handle project work, particularly, time-consuming work that may extend over a longer duration. And so often it is advisable to bring in some additional help, right, to provide some relief for your team. And so we help you plan those costs, right, so that you don't burn your team out. And then with that, we're now ready. So now we have our cost well understood. So now we're really ready to transition into how do we go acquire the funding for this work. And for that discussion, Cindy, over to you.
All right, thank you, Steve. Before we move over to funding, there's another poll question. Steve, could you read the poll question for us?
Yep, happy to. All right, who provides input to your HR technology roadmap? So select all that apply. HRIS, HR, IT, finance, and business.
Were those results coming in, Steve?
Just got them. Okay, results are in. All right, so HRIS 26%, HR 81%, IT 64%, finance 71%, and business 40%. Okay. Okay, so a variety of answers there.
And that's a great place to kick off the funding part of this conversation, because the important thing from there, the message there is it's not all HR, it's not just finance, but it's across the organization that you're going to need input to be able to get to not only the numbers, but the story around your funding. So I'm going to take us through the rest of the presentation. And because we're talking about funding, you may be expecting that all you're going to see on the rest of the slides is numbers, but that's not the case at all, because what we really need to do here in funding the roadmap is to tell a story. And the story begins with some things to think about before you get to the numbers, before you ask for the money. You may remember growing up when you wanted to buy something and you had to go ask your parents for money. You couldn't just go and say, hey, mom or dad, I need $100. You had to tell them a story. It's the same thing here. In most cases, you're asking for a lot of money. It's a major commitment for the organization. So as part of that, first of all, you need to understand the context. The context includes what's the company's technology approach. So here's where you're going to want to engage with your IT partner. Are you, as an organization, more interested in having your solutions on premises? And Steve talked a little bit about that. That's the build versus buy solution typically. Do you prefer, as an organization, to have your technology in the cloud so that there's less maintenance and support for your IT team and your other internal teams? Or are you somewhere in the middle? That's one area that you want to think about. Another is what's in the project. And Steve did a nice job of talking about in the roadmap, what modules are you really trying to implement here? And what's your priority? So are you going after strictly a payroll solution, a core HR solution? Are you looking for the advanced elements like talent management and succession planning? So what is it that's in your roadmap? And as you look at those elements, what part of those elements is important? And are there pieces of those elements that you're going to want to outsource? For instance, if you're implementing a new payroll solution, you may want to insource your gross to net calculation, but you may want to outsource the processing of garnishments, heavy administrative burden, a lot of hands-on, a lot of time consuming. So there are pieces of the work that you're going to want to outsource, pieces of the work that you're going to want to keep inside. And time and attendance and workforce management. Is this a new solution? Are you going to need to get hardware like clocks, or are you replacing a solution? Another thing that Steve mentioned, and we want to make sure that we're thinking about here, is your project timeline. There's two elements to your timeline. When's your kickoff and what's your duration? And are there any elements that are deadline sensitive? So for instance, if part of your implementation is payroll, most organizations want to start a new payroll solution on January 1st to minimize W-2 impact. If your timeline slides and you miss that, you want to understand the impact and any corrective action you may need to take or any additional effort that's going to be required for your organization. Steve also talked about resources, and this is, I'm going to reinforce some of what Steve said, because he's absolutely correct that a lot of organizations want to do projects with internal resources, which makes all the sense in the world, because once the project is complete, your internal resources have the most knowledge in terms of how that new solution is going to work and what are the details of that new solution. You want to have a very frank conversation about who's going to support the project, both in terms of skills, because if you want 80% of your team to come from your internal resources, that's a great growth opportunity. But if none of those resources have ever done project work, you may be creating another problem for yourself. So you want to be very particular about what internal and what external resources you need. Frequently, you're going to go outside for a project manager because they've done this over and over, and they're going to know where your pain points are, where you're going to run into roadblocks, and how to get around those. So this is all about funding. Going and getting your funding is really about telling a story. And we're going to talk in a couple of minutes about who you're telling the story to. You want to identify your audience, understand who you're telling the story to. You want to write a business case, whether you're going to have an informal conversation or a very formal process. You want to prepare a cost model, and we will talk about that in a couple of minutes. You want to lay out your slides. So are you using a formal PowerPoint presentation? Are you just doing an Excel spreadsheet? Or is there some other alternative? You want to build your advocates, understand who they are, and make sure you've got them on board. Test your story with your resistors. It's easy to tell the story to someone who supports everything that you're doing. It's better to tell the story as part of your preparation to at least one person who you know is going to have a lot of good questions, difficult questions, may think that HR is not worth investing in. It's a good idea to test this with the folks that you know might push back on you. And then practice, because whoever you're telling the story to is going to have questions for you that you're going to need to be able to answer. Who are your global audiences? You're going to have sponsors. Sponsors are the people who are going to hold you accountable throughout the project. You're going to meet with them regularly. You're going to talk to them about your budget, your scope, and your timeline, and whether you're on track for all of those, whether you're falling behind, what corrective actions do you need to take, and how do you take those actions? Who are your advocates? Across the organization, there are going to be people who are supporting you. They're your cheerleaders. When you're having a great day, you get to go and talk to them and they say, good job. More importantly, when you're having a hard day, and there will be hard days on these projects, they're going to listen and they're going to help you process so you can get through that difficult spot and get back aligned with what you need to do. Know who your resistors are across the organization. Not every one of them, but you're going to have folks that people know. This person tends to resist projects of this nature. This person is an influencer in the organization and they tend to be a contrarian. Have an idea of who those people are. And in some cases, you're going to want to go and build advocacy or at least neutrality with those people. And finally, who are your beneficiaries? Hopefully, everybody in your organization will benefit at some level from the work that you're doing. And you're going to have a change management plan to support getting them from their current state to their future state, where their life is going to be better because of the work that you're doing. As you get ready to ask for money, and that's really what we're getting to, is understand your decision makers. Is it your CIO? If all you're doing is swapping one technical solution for another technical solution, you may only need approval from your CIO. He or she may be the only person who cares. Is it your CEO or COO? Typically, broad-based business decisions are going to at least have to get by a review with the CEO and the COO. Your finance people, your chief financial officer, is probably going to have a significant impact. So bring them in early because you're spending their budget money, okay? And they're going to understand how that's going to impact both the income statement and the balance sheet, and they'll help to cue you in on that as well. If it's an HR project, if you're doing HCM and payroll, you obviously need your chief human resources officer. And hopefully that's your biggest advocate. Although you will find sometimes that with the right relationships across the organization, IT may be your biggest advocate, finance may be your biggest advocate. HR should be a very strong partner for you. And in some organizations, costs this big are going to need to go all the way to the board of directors. So know who your decision makers are and know what the process is. Do you have a simple process where you've got to influence one decision maker and you've got an informal conversation, or do you have a very complex process? Does anybody have a pocket veto? This is a question I always like to ask. A pocket veto is the person who has the influence and the credibility in the organization that if they review this or they hear about this, has the ability to go and say, why are we doing this at the senior levels of the organization, and to potentially influence shutting a project down or making you rework a business case. So understand if anybody in your organization has the pocket veto. It's important as an HR person. So I like to say, I've always said, in fact, throughout my career, as I'm a business person who happens to specialize in HR, what that means for me and what that means for effective HR organizations very often is that we understand and we can speak the language of the business. We understand that where we are in the business maturity cycle might indicate cash flow. And cash flow is going to influence whether we're going to get approval of this project. Organizations in a growth phase probably have a lot of cash, and there's a lot of opportunity to put projects in to get funding for. So understand your business maturity cycle. Whether your organization is domestic or global is going to influence not only the cost, but the complexity. Complexity includes your timeline. So understanding your footprint and how your project is being phased, because even with a global footprint, you may start with a domestic project, or you may start with a project outside of the US first and inside of the US last. So understand how that's going to impact your project. The industry that you're in and the workforce composition that you have is also going to drive elements of your program. Whether you need succession planning as the most critical module that you're going to put in place, or whether what you need is basic payroll and the ability to accurately and timely manage labor. So time and attendance, clocking in, clocking out in the old days, using your smartphone to enter your time. Those will drive both the complexity and the cost of your project. Where else in the organization is someone looking for money? It's a rare organization where there's only HR looking for money, because everybody has a mission, has goals and priorities, and most often needs money to achieve those goals and priorities. So understand from your income statement and your balance sheet where the money is. Balance sheet matters because in a few minutes, we're going to talk about capital items versus expense items. And remember, every dollar that comes into the organization can only be spent once. It comes in once and it goes out once. Where is your HCM project in the business priority list? And what critical business challenge can your project support? So understanding what other projects are competing for dollars may be your best avenue for getting funding approval. Because if there are 5 projects on the table for the business and a new HCM is going to support 3 of them in short order, that's going to be your biggest value for getting your funding. So understanding and partnering with the business so that you know what they need and how this process, this project can support their needs will benefit you. What's the business value? And I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just going to go through an example. So if there's other projects, there are competing projects for the money. Let's look at what one of those projects might be. Investing in a new line of business. How's an HCM going to support an organization that's investing in a new line of business? Well, your talent acquisition module may help you to more quickly identify and onboard new employees with specific skill sets. Your compensation modules may help you to design and administer better incentive and bonus plans to retain the right employees as you begin to expand that market, because you may have key current resources that you want to keep. Succession planning can help you to identify those. Compensation planning can help you to retain them. Overall, where does HCM fit? What are the business drivers that HCM will help to solve? One of the biggest ones that we see is decision-ready information. Not taking a day or 2 days or 3 days to run your reports and get them on the desktop, but to pre-build those reports on the desktop for your executive team. There are other challenges like systems challenges, resource scarcity. All of those you need to consider as you're getting ready to go and ask for money. The first thing, and Steve talked about this, is pull together a complete list of your current costs. Your finance team and your IT team may be able to help you identify the exhaustive list of current costs. And it doesn't include just people, it includes your hardware and software, and any process issues that you may be having could be dragging your costs. What are your future costs? You may want to build a spreadsheet, identify all of the items of cost for both current state and future state, and you have a column for each one. It will help you to go and look at those costs and make sure that you're collecting them all. Some of the areas where you're going to find cost differences, licensing, there may be skill premiums. You may need to upskill your team. The one caution is don't assume a reduction in staff with a change in an HCM. So you'll have these slides and you can look through these, and if you have questions, we'll continue to answer those questions for you. So when you're identifying future savings, you've got your spreadsheet with your current state and your future state. Realistically, are there savings? Moving to the cloud may create savings for you. Different skill sets may create savings for you. So go through that exercise in detail to figure out where your savings are. Now we've got another poll question. So Steve, I'm going to ask you to, if you could read the poll question.
You bet. All right. How likely is your company to adopt new HR technology in 2022? Choices are extremely likely, likely, maybe, not likely, and extremely, I think it's unlikely. All right, it'll be interesting to see the responses here. All right, results are coming through. Okay, extremely likely, 3%, likely 21%, maybe 34%, not likely 34%, and extremely unlikely 8%. All right, so most people kind of somewhere between likely to not likely.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
So here we go to the meat of it, building the ROI. A typical finance-related ROI, return on investment, in the numerator will have business value and the denominator will have investment. Both of these in dollars, and you want the same timeline in the numerator and the denominator. The reality in an HCM/payroll investment is that you're looking at the value of change versus the exact dollars. And by that we mean the value of this solution may be faster, better, more accurate access to information, which is used to make better business decisions, which can either increase revenue, reduce costs. The employee experience may see significant improvements, and Steve mentioned the digitization of the organization. So employees want, a lot of employees, not all, want to be able to pull their smartphone out of their pocket and use their smartphone to access. Compliance is a big one. I'm not going to beat that horse, but compliance, maintaining compliance, avoiding penalties and fees is very often one of the drivers of this change. The denominator is quite simple because it's going to be those hard dollars. So the ROI is really more a value of change rather than a pure financial conversation. The value proposition for the HR technology includes all of these things, and that's why you need to be able to tell the story about value. You can probably look in your organization with your finance folks and be able to put some dollar values on these. Not every one of them is going to come down to hard dollars. Some of it's about the story, about the experience, about the access to data today, this minute, to make a difficult decision. If all of the information that you have in terms of the 5-year cost of ownership, you're going to want to put on a chart. So let's say you looked at 2 different vendors. You're going to want to lay out the annual cost, and Steve showed you a little bit of this. Year 1 typically will be more expensive because you've got implementation costs. Make sure you don't forget to put in your implementation costs. The other way to look at cost is to look at your capital cost versus your expense. Your finance team can help you with this if you want help with it. We often help employers put together a capital versus expense budget. What can you capitalize and depreciate over time? So what costs are going to hit immediately on your financial statements, and which can you stretch out over time? The last question you want to ask yourself, the rest of the story, what if we do nothing? There's a lot of information on these next 3 slides. I'm going to pick a few items to talk about. So what if right now we're at risk for data privacy breaches? That's a compliance risk that will cost a lot of money and a lot of business capital in the marketplace if your organization is in the headlines because you've had a data breach. Compliance, data breaches, that's all part of the cost of doing business, and maintaining privacy of employee data is critical. The other one is consolidated reporting. If you don't put in a new solution, Steve talked about systems that are disconnected, trying to capture data, accurate data from multiple solutions can be time consuming and can result in bad reporting, meaning bad decisions. What's your turnover risk? So if you don't have the ability to understand your current organization, what it's costing you to pay employees, what your bonus and incentive structures are doing, are you really incenting the employees who you most need to push your organization forward? If you can't assess that, then you risk losing key employees, key resources, key skill sets. So understanding the dynamics of your employees in your organization are critical. And HCM that's built out with talent management, succession, compensation can help you to assess that and help you to maintain, retain, grow, develop your current resources over the long term. And one more thing, the lack of policy harmonization across the organization. You may have policies, but you may not be able to consistently administer those policies. Again, it will lead to organization dissatisfaction and distrust. So inaction may be the bigger story than the action. You need to have relationships with your executives. You need to speak the language of business. So when you're telling your story, you can speak the language of your audience. Engage in informal discussion. Have a 3-minute elevator pitch. So when you run into somebody who's an influencer, you can tell your story in 3 minutes or less. Discuss gaps in succession. Listen to pain points from your audience. And now you're going to go for your presentation to get approval for the money. Who's your audience? What are they expecting? What's the information that you're going to convey? And what questions are you expecting to get that you need to be able to answer coherently? Make sure you can deliver the details on the cost. Current cost, future cost, implementation costs, whatever those costs are. And finally, practice. Practice your presentation until you're confident and comfortable that you know you're going to be able, who your audience is, and you're going to be able to deliver effectively to that audience, that you've built your credibility and your influence to successfully request and gain approval for your funding. So it is a story. Funding is dollars and cents, but it's the story that surrounds the dollars and cents that most often will get you the approval for what you need for your funding. So that's the end of our presentation. There is some material. There's an appendix with some additional material that you should feel free to look at. And at this point, we are at the end of the presentation. We've got about 2 minutes left until the top of the hour. Steve, I have one quick question that I'm seeing.
Yeah, sure.
So how do I build the current system landscape? You had some really good pictures of system landscape. What tools might I use to be able to build that, and who might be able to help me do that?
So, I mean, typically the tools, we usually build those in Visio. And again, those are typically meetings that we have with, kind of the client side, technical experts. So typically folks both on the HR, IS side, as well as the IT side that really help us understand what all the different systems are and what all the different touch points are. And then oftentimes it's Microsoft Visio that we're using to document that. That's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So 1 minute to spare. Let me wrap us up with a couple of closing housekeeping items. There's going to be a survey at the end of this webinar. We please ask you to complete that. Your CPE or HRCI credit will be emailed in about 2 to 3 weeks. And again, we want to really thank you for coming out today, and do please attend our next 2 webinars. And with that, have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Cindy.